This is Dialog ASEAN25 with me, Naila Huda. And today we want to dive into the critical intersection of climate, capital and community in Southeast Asia. And at the heart of this conversation lies a crucial question of whether ASEAN can truly achieve sustainable growth without a firm commitment to ESG principles or environmental, social and governance principles. And today we're joined by three experts who bring unique insights from academia, industry and the front lines of community resilience to help us unpack this big question of ESG and whether these principles are enough to truly bring sustainable growth to ASEAN. First up, we have Dr. Peter Steck, Senior Lecturer at the Asia School of Business. His research focuses on innovation, sustainability and how developing economies can navigate these twin transitions between green growth and also digital transformation. Joining us as well, we have Khairunisa Zabidi, co-founder of Nusantara Consulting. It's a conservation finance advisory which works at the nexus of biodiversity, climate action and also investment. Khairunisa is an advocate for mobilizing private capital for environmental impact and really rethinking about how we value nature around us. And finally, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Srina Rahman. She's a lecturer at the Southeast Asian Studies Department at the National University of Singapore and US. Dr. Srina works directly with rural and coastal communities on conservation, livelihoods, and also, most crucially, social justice, especially when we're talking about ESG and how we can ensure local voices are included in this big conversation. So thank you very much to all our guests.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
First up, before we try to tackle this big question of ESG, the promises and the pitfalls of ESG in the ASEAN context, we want to look at policy, finance, but we also want to look at the local cultural context, the local realities, and potentially alternative models of sustainability. I think it's important to get this broader picture of what's actually happening. Perhaps Dr. Peter can help us paint this picture. What does ESG actually mean in the ASEAN context, in your interpretation, and how do these environmental, social, and governance priorities differ across the region? Yeah, and I hope together we'll be able to explore some of the I guess promises and potentially pitfalls of ESG in the ASEAN context. We want to look at policy and finance and also, most importantly, the local realities, what actually happens on the ground. And perhaps we can also leave some time to talk about potentially other alternative models to sustainability. But before we go into that, I guess it's better to sort of paint a broader picture of what's actually happening, what we're trying to unpack today, the meat of the issue really, looking at ESG in the ASEAN context. And perhaps, Dr. Peter, you can help to paint us this picture. What do you think ESG actually means in the ASEAN context today? And how do, if we look at these different elements, environmental, social and governance priorities, do they differ across the region and how?
No, thank you for that question. I think it's useful for the listeners to kind of go back to what are the origins of ESG. So the concept of ESG dates to maybe the late 1990s when the United Nations came up with the principles for responsible investment. This was being championed by Kofi Annan, then the Secretary General. And he basically tried to bring together the UN, kind of the important intergovernmental organization, with the corporate sector, with Wall Street. And that gave rise to the Millennium Development Goals and then now the Sustainable Development Goals that came after that. So essentially, it's the argument, ESG is the argument that big business and government should work together to kind of solve these global problems. Now, I would say within ASEAN, because most of ASEAN is still a developing country, social concerns actually dominate a lot of the conversation. Although perhaps in the media, when we talk about ESG, we often talk about E, the environmental component. And given the diversity we see in ASEAN, there can be many different drivers that affect different countries, different sectors in different ways. So looking at it from more of a business perspective, ESG is heavily influenced by supply chains and by the global financial system. For less developed countries, it's very influenced by official development aid. So depending on how integrated a sector or a country is, kind of they are faster with ESG adoption than in other cases. You also see a gap between energy importing countries and energy exporting countries or commodity exporting countries like Malaysia. So Malaysia is a big palm oil exporter, big oil and gas exporter, and that actually makes it a bit of a laggard in terms of some environmental energy transition adoption things, even though Malaysia is a relatively wealthy country within ASEAN. And I think the final point to make is that many ASEAN countries don't have this kind of pure American-style shareholder capitalism. We've got a lot of GLCs, we've got a lot of state involvement in the economy, we've also got a lot of family-owned businesses. And these kinds of organizations, they like to emphasize ESG. They like to emphasize more than just profitability. So I think that's another factor that can explain differences between sectors and ASEAN countries.
A lot of interesting points there, and I think that note on the emphasis on the E element of ESG, I'm pretty sure our other panelists would have a lot to say about the S and the G. Potentially, I think the S a lot more. I think there's, I would say, a lot less emphasis on the social aspect of ESG. But before we go into that, you know, ESG has been the popular buzzword for, I think, the past decade or so. But to put into the ASEAN context, why is ESG now being viewed as something that's very critical to meeting ASEAN's climate goals, especially now looking at the age of post-COP28?
Well, I think it's partly because governments are very reluctant to adopt certain regulations. And so emphasizing ESG as kind of placing the responsibility on the shoulders of large corporates to move the climate agenda forward. We've seen this in Malaysia with Petronas, with TNB, all adopting net zero commitments. Is a kind of way, perhaps, for the government to buy it some more time before it comes in with regulations such as a carbon tax and whatnot. I'm not necessarily saying that the emphasis on the ESG is misguided, but I would say that it shouldn't be an excuse not to have government regulation come in, which is very important for the large corporates, but also the smaller ones.
Just quickly going back on what you said about GLCs and a lot of state involvement, they tend to lean towards ESG. I guess that's something that's not what I assumed. Why do you say so?
I think one way of looking at it, before there was ESG in Malaysia, we had the new economic policy, for instance, right? And affirmative action in that way. You could say that there was also kind of an early form of ESG. And very often, if you read reports about state-owned companies, they tend to emphasize their social role, their role of stewardship of the nation's economy, the nation's development, sometimes to justify why their profits are perhaps not at the level that some investors would expect them to be. But basically, they emphasize that they have a broader social mission within the country. And I think given that origin, they are quite likely to keep emphasizing ESG. It fits very well within the narrative that they have.
Okay, now I hate to be cliched, but as you say, there is a lot of emphasis on the E part of ESG, and I do want to go into that at least now to look at the environmental aspect of ESG. Kairunisa, what do you think when we're talking about the ASEAN context? What we do see happening is ASEAN countries have updated their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, working towards lower emissions and whatnot. But how far do you see ESG investments actually go realistically in helping these targets?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I'd be really keen to just kind of engage with Peter's kind of thoughts earlier. I think what I find really interesting is the term ESG itself is used so interchangeably with other types of the language. So I think literacy, or at least our understanding of what we mean, may differ. So for example, we see that ESG as a term used interchangeably with terms like the triple bottom line, or sometimes we use it as we use the word sustainability, but actually they're two very different terms. Sustainability means being able to do things perpetually, for example, and now the hot term that I think a lot of the folks in the sector are using is regenerative. can we be regenerative as a collective, as a society, right? But if we're scaling it down to just the term ESG and how it's understood, at least by the corporate sector in the commercial space, then that it narrows it down quite significantly in terms of the conversation we're having, and sort of engaging directly with your question on whether or not ESG's investments are sufficient to meet at least the region's NDCs. I think that's a really tough question to answer. I think primarily because how we define ESG investments is also very broad. So, for example, it would be a subset of climate finance. And as Peter mentioned earlier, some of that would be, we would consider overseas development aid as part of climate finance. But if we're looking at it just private sector investments, so we're kind of looking at, do we have an understanding of the gap of how much it's actually needed for us to meet our climate targets? That in itself is not something we fully understand, right? So if we zoom it down to kind of how much does the region need for us to meet our NDCs? Lots of different reports. Just for Malaysia alone, like the BCG has a different number, our JETP has a different number, the Malaysian government cites a different number. So it's all, really depends on what, how we're actually attempting to meet the NDC. If we zoom it down to Malaysia alone, we're looking at, a certain, I think 90% of what we cite in the Prime Minister's office, for example, looks primarily at the energy transition, and that's only in the mitigation space. But there's also quite significant financing that's needed for adaptation, perhaps. And as you mentioned, climate risk, flooding, we're seeing a lot of that in this part of the world. We're not seeing as much go into those type of initiatives, or at least the adaptation sector. If we're looking at the region broadly, a lot of what some of the regions or countries that are attracting the Just Energy Transition Partnership, for example, in Indonesia or in places like Vietnam. And this is sort of a facility that supports transitioning away from coal. So as we know, as we transition away from high fossil fuel industries, because if we think about it, decarbonization is a pathway, right? Our region's very locked into a very high fossil fuel heavy development. And for us to shift that, we're going to need quite significant finance. And so the JETP attempts to look at long-term financing like coal power plants, where we've committed like 30 years of financing into, and in event, we transition to renewables, those assets would be debt assets on the bank's books, which then affects things like financing and the bank's abilities to continue to loan. And so those type of initiatives, I think we're attracting quite a lot of that here in this part of the world. We're looking at partnerships such as blended finance, for example, projects that look at partnering between government as well as the private sector. We're seeing more of that. But the real challenge in really scaling in ESG investments, I think it goes back to first the financing gap. We're also looking at how a lot of countries in ASEAN essentially have conditional NDCs. So what this means is that we're only going to be committed to meeting our NDCs if we actually receive aid and financing for it. So then it becomes like a bit of a political tool, doesn't it? And then there are investment risks as well in this part of the world. And we see that in some regions like Myanmar, less stable, very small countries that are still growing in economy, countries like Vietnam. So all this taken into account, I think really defines how financing flows and investment flows into this part of the world.
Dah cuba elak panas terik, tapi kulit kepala masih gatal dan berminyak. Mungkin ia kelemomo. Gunalah Head and Shoulders. Berkesan menghapuskan kelemomo sehingga 100% bebas kelemomo. Head and Shoulders.
Ya, pilih semua dalam satu. Ya, pilih Universe.
Susah hati gila rambut rosak? Pulihkan rambut anda dengan gabungan shampoo dan perapi Pantene. Dengan formula Pro Vitamin B5 dan Collagen, lebih 10 kali membaiki kerosakan. Jatuh cinta dengan rambut anda yang berkilat dan bernutrisi. Gunakan Pantene.
A lot to unpack there, a lot of really interesting points. But I think earlier on you did say something about there being a bit of confusion about the terminologies being used interchangeably. We're hearing a lot of regenerative being used now. We used to hear a lot about the circular economy and whatnot. Dr. Serena, if I can get your thoughts just quickly on this, do you think that the use of these sort of terminologies, this jargon, perhaps, I think that's what Greta Thunberg would call it, a lot of jargon being used. Is this, do you think, a part of greenwashing? Is this just good PR, or is there actual work being done here?
I'm an academic that doesn't like the big words, to be honest. I do my work, my practice.
That's quite rare. I believe
No,
it.
yeah, I can't understand half of it really. So that's just, and it's not easy for students to pick up on it too. And I find also I have a marketing background at one point, and really a lot of this is good sell, right? I mean, the whole purpose of ESG, to be honest, and I push the boundaries in what I say because I'm not necessarily tactful, but really what ESG does is enables businesses to keep going as per normal, and find loopholes and ways to sort of show that they are sustainable, but they're still using the energy and resources that they're using to make the profit, and using capital and financing whatever that they've always been doing. So it's just another way to sort of justify their existence, to cushion what they're doing, and lots of big words and catchphrases and jargon that makes it sound so much better. I'm sure there's good intent in many places where you can use this money to buy up entire forests and make sure that they are reforested. There's money that people want to spend on blue carbon, but on the ground, what does it really mean? How does this actually offset the losses that people and the planet are suffering as a result of overproduction, overconsumption, this kind of thing? I'm quite iffy about how effective it is when you get down to the ground and to the crunch. When I'm involved at sea, obviously, so I know a lot more about that than what happens in the forest. When it comes to things like, mangrove planting, because we know how much carbon it offsets, seagrass, seagrass punishment is something that they're doing now for blue carbon because they realize how much carbon seagrass captures. A lot of this is big PR. Things like this, as long as the habitat's behind my picture, if development pauses along the coastlines, if we stop damaging these habitats, they will grow back. That's how nature finds a balance. But if we are intent on, let's dig up this part because we need to continue with our development plans, and let's make up for it by planting something here, the success rates are really small. And so you're doing that, but you're not necessarily monitoring it or seeing whether these planting programs, for example, are actually working. It's a lot of, let's go plant mangroves, take a photo, and we've done this. We calculate our carbon offsets. We've got big media coverage. We involved so many fishermen. We held all these children came and did it. What does it actually mean on the ground? In 30 years, are those trees there? How does that help local livelihoods that you've cleared away because you've, reclaimed half of the shoreline? How does that actually translate in the long term for local economies? A lot of these things that are being done are also very top down. So where's the local input from the people who are directly affected by these things?
If I may, just kind of challenge you a little bit. All with you, first of all with you, but I just wanted to throw in a bit of a spanner in the works just for conversation. So I agree broadly, and I think a lot of what you said really lends to kind of old hat sort of CSR programs, right? Let's find the closest place we can put in this mangrove tree and then take a picture next to it, right? So when we first introduced our first set of reporting guidelines in I think it was 2006, Malaysia was the first in the region. And we did see a huge kind of wave of this type of activity, right? But the advent of the carbon markets really interests me, primarily because the standards for carbon integrity is so high, and it requires project developers to tell us upfront how the monitoring, reporting, and verification process for these projects will actually run. So I don't know, but I find that these standards mean that projects will now have to undergo quite stringent, which we've never seen in our old kind of CSR investments, requirements for project investors and developers to actually look at more robust MRV processes, which I find very exciting. So, we can look back in 30 years and see, okay, this seagrass here, which, sequesters something like 27 times more efficient. Oh yeah, there you go, 35 than your average like boreal forest. But it's really quite exciting to see like Asia in this part of the world, we're at the equator, and we see ourselves as like the most efficient carbon stocks, but sequester carbon as well. Could that process, at least in the carbon markets and the requirements for buying and developing credits, actually improve some of the activities that you're kind of raising?
I think there is a gap between what we're doing in terms of reporting and the requirements that are being done, and what is actually happening on the ground. So we have, in recent years, with this community that I work with, developed this tree planting thing after 1.5 decades of resistance. My friends were saying, look, at the very least, it's a source of income for the community. And so I will go out there and say, okay, if you want to plant trees, we need monitoring programs. You guys not interested, but this is what we do. And companies will come back to us and say, no, exactly what you said. No, we have to report by these standards. We need to do this. And I'm like, okay, so then provide the funds for us to do this, or you come down and let us know. So this recent run of planting has taken place over the last 3 years. We had a great funder from through a sort of a matching NGO, and so we had funds from the US. They are asking us for reports, but other local, let's say, Malaysian, not that we are specifically bad because we're local, but the ones who are actually here and saying, look, we're going to put in some money, we're going to plant some trees, we are interested in the long term, they don't come back for the monitoring. And when I ask them, don't you need to report this? They're like, oh, no, it's fine. Yeah. So, there is a difference between, and you can cook numbers, right? So there is, yes, you have all of these policy requirements. Yes, there is evolution, but what is actually happening on the ground? And how still does that translate into benefits to local people? And why is there a need to spend money on this when this stuff will grow back naturally if you just don't disturb it? Or you carve out spaces where it's not disturbed. So you see, we're spending money where we've destroyed things, whereas we can look at ways to improve livelihoods. We can look at ways to section off spaces that can be preserved, that can be sources and seeds for other spaces. So yes, there are ways to improve, to fix the damage, but at the bottom of it, there's still damage, right? So what we're doing is we are reacting to stuff and patching things up. Peter, I don't know if you want to jump in and add on.
I think we're both
no, it's fine.
At you've lost us both at sequestration and blue carbon. Yeah, you've lost us there. But I think if we were to go along that notion, we might have to throw out E entirely from ESG. It's all greenwashing, it's all PR. So perhaps we can move on to the S part of ESG, to look at social responsibility, to look at livelihoods, because Dr. Serena also mentioned that important part about locals wanting to make a livelihood, wanting to make an income, right? So that's an important aspect to this. Dr. Peter, if you might want to comment on that a bit, but if we were to look at current ESG frameworks, the standards that's been set, is there enough being done to support job creation, to support livelihoods, social equity in these climate adaptation efforts?
Well, this is a good question, and very interesting discussion earlier as well. I think if we do interviews with a lot of ASEAN policymakers, they at least pay a lot of lip service to vulnerable groups. Think about hawkers, the lower income groups, and so on. And it explains, for instance, why Malaysia is struggling to remove fuel subsidies, for instance. Essentially, we are now subsidizing the emission of greenhouse gases, right? That's one way of framing it. So I think many policymakers are mindful of this. At the same time, I think they have a difficult trade-off. And Serena makes a very good point. If you stop destroying the environment, you don't need to place it back, right? But there are pressures to develop, to do new things. And you need to weigh as a society whether the benefit from that outweigh the cost. And that's often going to be a difficult question. Now, if you specifically look at the energy transition aspect, especially for Malaysia, solar panel installation makes a lot of sense to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that is an area that's relatively labor intensive. It's also an area where you kind of need medium skilled labor. People can be upskilled and earn quite good income from that industry. Whereas a lot of other like large scale sectors like oil and gas or maybe even coal power plants, they tend to be very capital intensive, but not particularly labor intensive. So I think while the labor discussion is important, and of course, if the transition happens too fast in a particular area, it's an area of concern. I wouldn't say that the social aspect is something that should stop you from doing a lot of the environmental things. I think there are ways that you can do it in a way that is ethical and that's supportive of local communities.
Kerap menggaru kulit kepala disebabkan kelumumur, masalahnya lebih mendalam. Gunalah Head and Shoulders menembusi 5 lapisan untuk membasmi kelumumur dan kegatalan. Bebas kelumumur sehingga 100%. Head and Shoulders diuji secara dermatologi.
Senyuman bahagia di hari yang mulia, sinarkan cahaya pada semua. Mulakan amalan mengukir masa depan. Hong Leong Bank kan ada jadi peneman.
Rambut gugur lagi? Macam mana Gunakan Pantene Baharu dengan provitamin mikro yang meresap dan menguatkan rambut dari dalam. Rambut 10 kali lebih kuat terhadap rambut gugur. Pantene Baharu.
Karenisa, perhaps you have any thoughts on this if we were to go into the S aspect of the ESG. I guess arguably tend to be overlooked. Any thoughts on how this green transition can be more just, more inclusive, especially to look at vulnerable communities, small businesses, SMEs in the region? How can they be more included, involved in this transition?
I think there's no silver bullet answer, honestly, but primarily quite a lot of standards, at least international standards, are attempting to bake in requirements or standards to allow for social and community benefits. So for example, when we look at the carbon credit market, while the top standards have very high carbon integrity requirements, so how do you measure carbon? Because when we talk about climate change, primarily that's sort of the big interest in terms of decarbonization, right? But a lot of these standards are now adding in an additional S and G component to it. So for instance, there's something called the CCB, which is the community and biodiversity benefits, which are considered co-benefits to projects, making projects a lot more attractive to potential buyers. So when you're developing a particular intervention to, for example, you're looking at nature-based solutions, we've got floods in places like Johor. Could we invest in sponge cities, for example, that China has quite extensively invested in to deal with those floods? So if you look at it from a pure climate point of view, then potential investors will just be looking at, oh, how much carbon can we sink? So you're just looking at trees, putting in high carbon sequestering kind of processes, right? Or even if we look at CCUS, that's also pure carbon. But then you can add an additional layer of biodiversity and community benefits to that, and therefore it would make the potential price per carbon or price per hectare a lot higher to buyers who are looking at purchasing packaging such as that. So those are some of the ways that we can include S and G factors. I think as we move towards like more novel types of exploring more novel approaches outside of the current frameworks of ESG, things could look very, very different. But if we're just kind of focusing in on that engagement, I think that's primarily where I could look at. For example, I think we might discuss this later on, but I worked on the National Climate Change Act, and there was a question around like how can we include Indigenous voices, for example, as part of this discussion, and even baking that in and engaging was very challenging because, first of all, we've taken away your rights, we've basically colonized you, and then now we're asking you to come to the table and help us develop language for our laws that you probably don't have language for, and you'll be, that everyone are technocrats in the room. So even designing these engagements are quite challenging. So unless we flip it around and we say that there's actually quite a lot of Indigenous knowledge that you can bring to the table and design it that way, then it looks very different. But if we're just providing a token spot for someone who's for diversity, then very different conversation.
Yeah. Interesting point there, and I think we can go into that, go into local context, into Indigenous voices, being more inclusive, and also on that note that you made about these measurements, these standards, these benchmarks that need to be set, they're often leaning towards or lean on global targets, global metrics that's being set, and they're being standardized and uniformed. But obviously, we need to take into account the local context, local needs. How can we create ESG strategies? I guess I want to pose this question to Dr. Serena. How can we, I guess, imagine or create ESG strategies that are more grounded in local context, cultural context and values, and not just depending entirely on international benchmarks? Is there a way to, I guess, be more inclusive in this, or is the problem still with ESG itself?
Well, I think the last point that Karen brought up was really nice, right? So you need to flip it, and you need to recognize, and clearly there is movement for this, that there is a lot of local knowledge that needs to be incorporated. Academics like ourselves go to spaces, take information from local people, and we publish. We don't recognize the people who give us that knowledge. Everything that I know about the Tabrau Strait comes from the local fishermen. I'm the one with a PhD, but they're the ones with the knowledge. I just happen to have this because I can write in academic language in English. So it's a very important point that they don't speak the language of the bureaucrats who are writing policy. And that then means that we are losing all of this information. You can see that at the COP level, they're making an effort, huge effort, to find this knowledge. So they have these regional meetings, they are actively inviting Indigenous people to speak. But, people who are entrenched in their habitats are not comfortable going to big meetings where there are lots of people who dress differently from them, where they have to address people. So to get the local context, you have to go to the local ground. And on a practical term, as a person who works in an office, as a person who is the liaison between government, consultancies, big companies, Bursa, where do you find the time to do this? How do you know how to communicate with these people? Do you then use an NGO as a go-between? Does the NGO then, which happens a lot, and I've seen this, does the NGO then inadvertently put in its own goals into the conversation instead of what is truly the local view and desire? Can that local view and desire match the government level narrative, the business narrative? Or if it doesn't match, is it going to be ignored and rejected and deemed not enough knowledge? They don't know what they're talking about. How do we flip the conversation, as Karen said, to make sure that there is a meeting point?
I think there's some really novel things that have been explored, right? Like, for example, in places like New Zealand, they're giving rights, legal rights to entities like forests and mountains.
Rivers, yeah.
Right, and I'm actually going through a training to represent nature as a proxy on boards. So that's something that, some movements in parts of Europe are kind of exploring. It hasn't arrived here, but I think it's like a really novel kind of way, and doors are opening. We are seeing, for instance, like I'm working on a project called the Natural Capital Accounts, and this is the first time the Malaysian government are looking to build a set of accounts that we've never seen before. Recognizing natural capital as an asset class as opposed to an extractive resource, and instead as a capital that we can use for forever for our children. And I think shifting governance models as well to adaptive learnings, using living labs, climate assemblies, are some of the more novel things we can explore, as long as, these solutions are brought to places where it can be heard. I think it can scale potentially.
Yes,
Yeah.
and hopefully they can be implemented in a language that local people can understand and it's
Yeah.
made relevant to them. There is progress on the ground where we have developers in Johor who, after discussions with them, not necessarily just by me, but with a whole bunch of other people, are working towards giving up some parts of their huge plots of land for preservation. It's not necessarily regenerating, but instead of destroying, they're going to preserve it. And then through that, then how much carbon, whatever financing can they get out of it? So that's one way that people have been adapting and have been indicating that they're willing to give up some of that profit for some preservation. At the same time, they're using some funds that they get as a result of that to contribute to local communities. So there are ways. But how does that language happen? You always need a go-between. You need a bridge. And this is sort of a field that people are discussing a lot more now. There's publications on it. Who is that middle person? Is it someone with the community's interests at heart to be able to understand both sides of the story and communicate it? Can that person come from the community without having some kind of political position, hierarchy, whereby the even more marginalized don't have a voice? So finding those authentic local champions is always the issue. The world is a difficult place, and at this point, it's quite dreary. But given that there are so many innovations that Karen is saying, it really is hopefully that the policy level does take on these things. I mean, it would be wonderful if our government could give my seagrass patch in the background rights as an individual. You'll see me dancing to the moon. But I wait for that day.
I quite like the dynamic that's going on here. Dr. Serena offers a rather somber reality check, and then Karunisa will offer, the more, I guess, optimistic view on things that, things are actually looking quite hopeful, and we're remaining hopeful on that. But you did mention a little bit about policies and how this needs to reflect the needs on the ground, and we're looking at fragmentation across ASEAN. Not just in terms of the local cultural context and values and whatnot, but we're also looking at market fragmentation. And Dr. Peter, if you're still with us, we want to look a little bit on the market side of things as well, and also on the policy side. When we look at market fragmentation across the region, that could potentially be a huge barrier, right? So I guess what kind of regulatory or policy harmonization that could be seen to make ESG a lot more effective across the board in ASEAN?
Yeah, I would like to actually hook into that point about basically the small players versus the big players in terms of sustainability standards, to answer your question. What we very often see is that for, let's say, a sustainability standard like the RSPO, the Responsible Palm Oil Standards, Sustainable Palm Oil Standards, smallholders often struggle to comply with these standards, and there are many different reasons for that. One is that the standards tend to be designed by larger corporations, right? The large stakeholders who design a standard that kind of meets their need. They can do it at scale, and then it's kind of an afterthought is, oh gosh, we should bring in the smallholders because we don't want to throw them under the bus. And it seems to be a kind of natural process that occurs in many different sectors. So then the involvement of smallholders is very important. But at the same time, sometimes smallholders are used to weaken the standard, right? People say, okay, we're just going to, we need to incorporate these smallholders, we need to be inclusive, but really these smallholders are not completely independent. They're actually dependent on some kind of middleman, or they're part of some kind of conglomerate. So yes, officially they're independent, but really they're not. And they're sometimes a weapon that's used to kind of erode standards as well. So I think we need to be aware of that dynamic. And I think the final interesting point about smallholders from our research is that, for instance, if you look at palm oil in the state of Johor, many smallholders are relatively old. They're in their 40s and 50s. And it's not entirely clear if their children want to take over the business. And that could also, for instance, be true for fishermen, I would imagine. These were kind of sustenance jobs, pardon me, which are slowly going away, and the next generation, fortunately, has better opportunities. So it's a very complicated issue, is what I wanted to highlight, with no easy exit.
quickly
Yeah.
there. So I would also add, just to add a bit of color and context for the Malaysian context. So our largest landowner in the peninsula is Felda, and it was they own over 1 million hectares of land, I think, across the country, and it was kicked off sometime in the 80s as a poverty alleviation scheme. And as you said, you cite like in Johor where the children are 40s, in their 40s or 50s, but smallholders in Felda, the original settlers that were given plots of land as part of this poverty alleviation scheme, are now, in their third generation. So they're no longer here. And you're looking at grandchildren. So they're by law not allowed to sell the land. So they're given 3 to 5 hectares of land. And they're children, maybe they have 5, and then now grandchildren 15. So because they can't sell, they have to split that profits between the family members. And now 3 generations on, it's not going to be, nobody wants to work on this land. And so the government, because it's enshrined in law that this piece of land cannot be sold and they cannot grow anything on it other than rubber or palm oil, it means that they're stuck. So this idea of poverty alleviation, are they keeping people poor because of this initiative? And in fact, I think the only policies that they're introducing are quite it's quite band-aid solutions. So a new company will come in, we will run the company for you, because you don't want to work on the land, we will then do the planting, the harvesting, and then we'll do a 60-40 split. So now you're splitting 40% or 60% of the profits among 15 grandchildren. So really, there are big questions around what you're saying specifically in this part of the world.
Yeah, Dr. Peter, taking this into account, do you see potentially ESG morphing or evolving into something that looks a little bit different in the future?
Oh, that's a good question, but I think it basically just shows the complexity. But what actually the point I was trying to make is that so the question of harmonization, that basically because we have large differences between different ASEAN member states, because we have these large differences, there is an argument for not having harmonization in particular areas, by having local standards that work better for local communities, that might not always be as strict, but that function in terms of capacity building, keeping certain stakeholders on board. And then at the same time, they can coexist with international standards in some areas. So I think especially the financial sector, you see a strong push towards kind of more harmonized standards, also international. So you've now got the IFRS S1 and S2 reporting guidelines, which seem pretty much universal. I mean, many ASEAN countries have a version at least of that. And you also see that standards can coexist, right? With palm oil, we mentioned there's RSPO, but in Malaysia we have MSPO and ISPO, which are different standards, which these countries feel better meets their needs. So I think the fragmentation of the market is not always bad. And what we can strive for is more mutual recognition, perhaps, rather than kind of forcing a standard system. And I think it's also important to recognize the role of the ASEAN Secretariat, which acts as a kind of policy coordination and diffusion system. So although we don't have like the EU, where Germany and Bulgaria have identical laws, Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand, Vietnam, they're all learning from each other. They often have quite similar frameworks. So I think in that sense, we probably have the right level of flexibility and harmonization within the region, I would say.
We have just about a couple minutes left. I think, Dr. Srina, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just very quickly on the RSPO, what they've done really to accommodate the smallholders, whether they're in Felda or not, is the jurisdictional approach. And in Sabah, they've done this really well, tapping on NGOs to go to the ground to help people overcome these, financial and other restrictions that the RSPO sort of imposed on them. And I think, as Dr. Peter mentioned, that really it is about recognizing that local standards are as good as international standards, which is often the biggest sort of issue here. And I think one thing that has not been mentioned is the political will. So we can have all of these standards, we can have, all of these innovations, but if there is no political will to support a different way of doing things, if there is no political will to not give in to big money, say government funders, to think about other ways of running things, then it's not going to happen. right? And every new standard and every new piece of jargon that we use is just going to be words. So we need that political will. We need policies that are looking forward, that are speaking to local people. But if you don't have that push behind, you don't have a push from the ground so that local voices are heard, it's not going to work. Everything has to come together.
Yeah.
Sorry, again, I'm depressing. But
And perhaps Karonisa can rescue us from this. Yeah, just as some parting words, is this an area where we can celebrate difference and variation as opposed to a uniform standardized measurement or benchmark?
I have some bad news. I think I'm going to start by saying that, as someone who's worked in this sector for so long, I was at COP 14, it's what, COP 30 now, right? So, I think many of us are like, I find that many of us in this sector, for a long time, we're kind of like knocking on doors saying like, look, we have to sit up and listen, right? Governments and businesses have to sit up and listen. I read a really important book last October, which just changed the way I saw my work. And really, truly, we feel it in here, right? The book was written by Jem Bandel. He's famous for his paper Deep Adaptation, which was behind the Extinction Rebellion's demands in the UK. And the book was called Breaking Together, a freedom-loving response on collapse. And the book was twofold. So the first half suggested that there are indicators for collapse, that, a lot of us talk about tipping points, and we're like, oh, it's in some far off future in 2050. And so, it suggests that actually we are past tipping point. It suggests that there's lots of indicators suggesting that we are at the point of quite serious economic and social collapse. So if the financial system, for example, collapses in the next couple of years, then we're going to see potential for war. We don't know if the nation state will survive. So arriving at that, I must say, felt very liberating for me as someone who works in climate change, because then that attachment to the outcomes of our work to say that can we make a difference through all this work we're doing, either on the front lines or through policy or through reforming economic systems, releasing that felt very liberating for me. And Cristina Figueres, who's she's the architect of the Paris Agreement, has been bringing climate leaders to a place called Plum Village, which is a Buddhist monastery, to really let climate leaders sit and sink in and really feel what we feel. And these anxieties are coming up. What I think a lot of us at the front lines suspect, which is it's too late, has come to the fore. And so for me, quite a lot of my work has kind of been shifting towards like, okay, let's look at adaptation. How can we best build resilience on the ground if mitigation is no longer a story? Am I happy with working on economics and natural capital for the next 35 years of my career? If I live that long, yes, but am I attached, and do I feel attached to the outcomes of it as I used to feel? I don't think so. So I think accepting that perhaps humanity, as part of our boom and bust cycle, is if human beings could be on the decline, then could we go out with a smile? Could we go out peacefully, and could we go out with as little suffering as possible? And how do we then hospice modernity? More like we can lead to that suffering.
Yeah. And on that depressing note, we do have to wrap things up now. But I guess that reality check is definitely necessary. I mean, we're talking about all components of the ESG. We do need that reality check. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. Really great points, very insightful conversation. Thank you so much to our panel today, Dr. Peter, Karonisa, and Dr. Serena. Albeit a little bit depressing, but we can't run away from the reality of what's actually going on out there. And we hope that, with this conversation, policymakers, decision makers have this in mind about what's actually happening in reality, what's happening on the ground. And we hope that this reality check helps a little bit. Thank you so much again to all our guests today. That's all that we have for Dialog ASEAN25. Today with me, Naila Huda. We'll catch you next time.
Menggaruk kulit kepala disebabkan kelumumur, masalahnya lebih mendalam. Gunalah Head and Shoulders menembusi 5 lapisan untuk membasmi kelumumur dan kegatalan. Bebas kelumumur sehingga 100%. Head and Shoulders diuji secara